On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's program with Jennifer Senior, discussing All Joy and No Fun, the Paradox of Modern Parenthood, in conversation with Daniel Gilbert.
Thank you. What a pleasure it is for me to be sitting here with my friend Jen Senior, and thank you all for coming to hear us chat for a bit with each other, and then to hear her chat with you. I came to meet Jen a few years ago, well, I guess maybe a couple of years after my book came out, maybe shortly after. She was doing a piece for New York Magazine, and as a journalist, she called and said, "Can I come interview you?" And she came up, and I chatted with her, and I thought, oh my God, this woman is really interesting and smart. And it's been a great pleasure to get to know her and become friends with her over the ensuing years. When Jennifer started this book, she wasn't sure anybody would ever want to read it, and she hammered out a copy and she sent it to me and said, "Would you let me know what you think of this draft?" And this is a horrible position to be in when someone you like sends you their book and says, "What do you think?" Because it's kind of like when your spouse says, "How do I look in these jeans?" There's only one right answer, and what am I going to do? What am I going to say? So I cracked it open and I read it, and I was just blown away. I thought, this is brilliant and beautifully written, and it was the kind of book that made me glad I'd never attempted to write a second one by comparison. So I was very proud to appear on that cover and say nice things about Jennifer. So, your book. So, in all of social science, I can only think of maybe two findings that everybody who knows about the science is scared to say in public.
Yeah.
The first are findings in the area of race and intelligence, or women and men and innate mathematical abilities. Nobody wants to talk about that because it's pretty easy for people to misunderstand you and think you're bad. The second one is happiness in children. Now, the data are very clear that children do not increase people's measured happiness. In fact, many studies suggest they actually make it go down. This turns out to be the truth we dare not speak. And so I just wanted to start by asking you two questions about it. One, why are we so scared of this fact? And two, in what way do you think this fact is only part of the point?
I should have known you were going to ask me two questions that no one else has asked me the entire time. They're
right,
great.
You're used to talking to Colbert. Lightweights, come on. Senior, you're Cambridge.
I know. All right, fair enough. Okay, so, why we don't talk about this. I mean, number one, here's one thing that you had told me when you ever mentioned this data on the road, that the only people who had come up to you quietly and say, yes, it's true, were grandmothers, because they'd done it, right? And they could look back, and the fact of having raised their kid, now that experience now occupied some kind of privileged real estate in their memory. So they were no longer feeling the same kind of ambivalence that they might have been feeling when they were in the midst of it. And I think that kind of ambivalence is so powerful that, it's hard to talk about. But I also think, well, let's face it, I mean, there are all sorts of crazy imperatives now that I think moms in particular, but fathers too, have to sort of, heed. I mean, there's now this kind of full saturation parenting model that we all have. If you're not down on the floor playing with your kids, full immersion, you suck, right? And I think that I don't know how large the bookshelf here is dedicated to parenting books, but I would say that there's this overwhelming sense that you have to do this right. And so, I mean, it's bad enough that you have to do it right, but to then go on and say that you're not even sure you're enjoying it. I mean, I would think that, in the midst of, also, if I could just say, I think that things like parenting message boards and Baby Center and Urban Baby and all these things, I think they make that conversation quintuply hard to have now that the hoi polloi, one really abrasive response to this can haunt a person for forever if you actually confess to ambivalence. So I think that that's some of it too. The second part about what?
Well, but before going on to the second part, I mean, there's lots of things we all do in the world that we think are important and useful and good and right, and they're a lot of fun to do. I work hard to prepare a lecture, to teach a course for my students. It's not fun to do, but I really believe in it. Why is it with parenting it's somehow, we can't just say, well, no, this isn't fun, but I think it's important and useful. Why do we have to go, no, it's fun? Why are you
Do you
kids
think
not
that,
loving your child
oh,
if you
right,
say
I
it's
know.
not all
Well, I
fun?
have been, but I'm not sure. Can I ask you a question? I'm not sure it's totally unsafe to say. I mean,
Okay.
I might push back on that a little bit. And I feel like certainly with my friends, we talk about this a lot. I also think it's like a common, you have a common vocabulary for talking about what annoys you about your children. You know, you can talk about how annoying it is to wake up in the middle of the night, and that's safe. You can talk about like the fact that you don't like having spit up on all of your clothes.
Right.
That's safe. You can talk about the fact that your teenager is a complete pain in your ass. Perfectly safe. Can I say that on GBH?
Yes.
A complete pain in the rear. You know, that there are things that are safe. It's what's less safe is saying you're bored. Like I've noticed that is
Oh.
something that absolutely, and I think that it's almost as if it's the opposite of love. But to me, boredom is the opposite of fun, and I think it's okay to say that. You know, but I think that certain areas are okay, you know, okay for discussion. I think there's also this idea that you're not being imaginative enough as a parent. If you're not enjoying your kid, you're doing it wrong. I think it's also like raising a kid is now, it's kind of like assumed the romantic mythological status of like marriage in a Jane Austen novel. It's like, finally, I have my kid and I live happily ever after,
Yeah.
you know, and I think that that's maybe just because of how we've arranged it chronologically, you know, first you have your job.
Yeah.
Well, first you graduate from, this is a middle class life. I'm only talking about the middle class, of course. But first first you graduate, then you get your first job, and then you find your spouse, and then you marry your spouse, and then you have your first apartment, and then you have your kid. So it has to be great. You waited last to do that. It's like dessert, you know? So, you know, I mean, I would say maybe that, I'm curious what you think, because I can't fully explain the pushback. I mean, it is, and I'm now getting the most wretchedly cruel responses, you know, in the blogosphere and, you know, on Amazon. People who say outright, I haven't read your book, but man, you suck as a mother. I mean, it's really amazing. And it's like, can you at least crack the binding? Just, you know, go to a bookstore and just read a page. You know, and I'm curious why you, because
Wow.
you've gotten tons of hate mail
Yeah,
over
and
reporting
I've never written
this
a book
stuff.
on this, but when I give talks about happiness, I will talk about these data, the slight negative correlation between children and happiness, and it doesn't matter what else I say in the talk. It's the only thing people want to talk about afterwards, and I will get email, very
Yeah.
hateful emails.
But do you have a
saying,
theory
You're
why?
a horrible person. I don't know. I mean, I think people, it may be sacred. It may be something about which many people can't have a rational discussion because it's a sacred issue, loving your children, and anything that looks, smells, feels, sounds like it might be antithetical to that is just taboo from the start.
Well, then there's an I'm sorry, then there's a historical explanation, right? That somewhere along the line, when, to quote my favorite sociologist, Viviana Zelzer, when kids became economically useless but emotionally priceless, it became unsafe to say this. Certainly there was a time when kids were just regarded as like morally defective adults. You know, they
Right.
just weren't regarded with the same kind of sentimentality. And as our sentimentality about children grew, which happened to be like inversely proportional to their economic value, you know, we suddenly, like this was the new value they had, that they were priceless
Right, right.
economically. So you couldn't talk about them any other way.
So I was
And
going
we
to
have
ask
fewer
you,
of them too, if
I
I
was
can
going to
just
ask you
say.
how we got in this position, but that is pretty much the answer.
I think that's sort of and I mean, and you know, we now, again, a lot of births are accidental, but we do have control over how many we have in an unprecedented way. We can space them apart as we'd like, and, you know, we have fewer, so we assign all this value to these things that we've waited so long to have, that we've spaced apart, you know, or worked through reproductive technology to have, I mean, all these things. But I think historically, I mean, there was a time when, you know, I mean, during the colonial era, I mean, parents called their children it. You know, I mean, they did, and they often buried them. I mean, this is not all of them, and it's funny. It varied regionally. There was more affection for kids down south, but I mean, they were frequently called it. They were, you know, buried in the backyard with pets sometimes when they died early. I mean, this is not you know, if you we've come quite some distance from that, you know, to my getting hate mail and you're getting hate mail. I mean, you know, and also I think if you had 10 of them, you couldn't afford to be quite as sentimental about
Right.
them, and you had a kind of ruthless economic. I mean, I'm sure parents always loved their kids. I'm sure they did, but they also had an economic function, and they've since lost that kind of productive function in the house.
Right.
So
I
that's
mean,
that.
so it seems to me the danger of these illusions, because after talking about these data, some people will say, I hate you, Professor Gilbert. But I will also get, many times I'll get young mothers who will come up and say, thank you. I thought I
Right.
was all alone in thinking, I love my child beyond belief, but oh my God, this is hard and I'm bored a lot. And I sometimes wonder if I made the right decision. Thank you for letting me know that other people think this too.
That was the only reason I wrote the book in a funny way, was that I thought that there was no normed knowledge about this. That, I wanted to get I wanted to go into each silo of social science and pull all of this information on and put it all on one shuttle and put it all and weave it all through one loom and have everybody look at it and go, oh, it's not just me. I'm in the middle
Right.
of that bell curve. And the arguments I'm having with my spouse are the arguments that everybody's having with their spouse. And our marriage is not really any worse than any other married couple
Right.
with a 2-year-old. And they're duking it out over the same stupid stuff.
Right.
And it feels really treacherous in it. But it's not because I'm weak or I'm doing something wrong or that we're failing to appreciate our baby. I mean, that is the only, because there's nothing prescriptive in this book. I mean, it's all reported and, as you know, yeah. And data driven, and people, that's my favorite kind of question that I can never figure out how to answer is when people say, so what should I do? And I'm like,
Buy another copy.
yeah, can't tell you.
Well, it's funny when you say data driven, because when you said you were going to first master the entire field of social science on children and happiness, I thought that's daunting.
Yeah.
But I thought, bravo for you.
Yeah.
Then you said, but I'm also going to go out and meet people and write their stories. And I thought, oh crap, because I'm a scientist, and it's very easy to find a story that fits whatever belief you have. Data are what we care about. So when you sent me this book, my first thought was, oh God, it's going to be data with a bunch of Gladwell stories. I have to tell you, as much as I really appreciated the data, and bless you, you know more about this area of psychology than I do. You really got it right. I learned a lot from those stories.
Oh,
They were
good.
not gratuitous. They weren't the human interest piece. So why? I mean, tell me just, maybe
'Cause-
you could tell all of us a little
yeah,
bit how
no.
you combine data and going out and meeting people. And,
First of all, this is what magazine journalists do. I mean, so some of it was just native. Second, finally, 22 years later, my anthro major made sense. My parents were mystified. Why on earth would you major in anthropology? And I had this instinct, the way we live now, little subcultures, Anyway, so that was some of it, just like an ethnographer's instinct. Third, I'll tell you, I read Annette LaRue's Unequal Childhood. Have you ever read it?
No.
It's damn good. So it just made you realize that data can take you so far, and then you need to be in people's lives and see what it looks like, right? You just need to. So you can read data about say for instance, poor women traveling 3 hours to get to their jobs, right? Their minimum wage jobs. Then you can read a story, as she did, about a poor woman who had to take her children on the bus to go to her minimum wage job and was exhausting the patience of all the people who were caring for that kid while she was going to these jobs. And she had this unbelievable story. You can read data that suggests it's expensive to be poor, that that bank accounts elude you, that you can't meet minimum fees, all these things. She had this, it's stuck in my head for forever. Story about a woman who had exhausted the goodwill of every small business owner in her neighborhood because they were sick of making change to give her quarters to do her laundry. Now, how does that show up in data? It doesn't, right? It showed up in her book in this way that how many years later? I read it when it came out in 2003, and in 2014 I'm still talking about it, right? And so if you can be open-minded and not go into a family with any fixed ideas about what parenting is and let them kind of surprise you, it's the shizzle, it's the bomb, it's the greatest. And so that to me was the whole ball game. And and also because, as we know, the data falls short in some I've been thinking a lot about what you and I have talked about. We have this argument where I say, or I use phrases like, it's a different kind of happiness. And Dan says very patiently, there's no such thing as different kinds of happiness. There's just happiness. And I go, yes, there is. And he goes, I know more than you do. No, there isn't. And we have this like
Which
back
never,
and forth.
which never convinces me.
Or you never can ever convince us. But like, so here's something that data can't show, right? And yet every parent will still say that they have this transcendent, this goes to the second half of your opening game, will still say that parenting is like transcendently wonderful and unrivaled in some ways that are just magic and right, there's no experience that can quite compare. Okay, and if it's not showing up in these data, what do we want to think, how do we think about these data? So I try and chronicle some of those kind of transcendent moments in my book. And it occurs to me, because you had written this as a comment in my original manuscript, I had said at one point, there was this beautiful moment where Jessie, she's this mom who is beyond likable. Like, I wanted to wrap her up in tissue paper and take her home with me afterwards. I really loved her. She just had this moment with her son where she scooped him up and was just slow dancing with him. And he just kind of melted into her, like their skin was inseparable. The music was really pretty. And you could just see her breathing him in. He smelled like shampoo. And she was just in some blissed out other planetary place, right? And I said, a social scientist can't measure this. I wrote this in my notes, and you wrote, I said, how do you plot this on a graph of 1 to 5? And you wrote back, easy, 5. And I was like, busted, fair enough, okay. But here's what I've come back to, okay? But here's the difference, Dan, okay? And this is what I'm here to tell you tonight. So it's a 5. You're gonna tell me I'm wrong, but I'm gonna say it anyway. It is a 5. But when I go out to dinner with you tonight, it's gonna be awesome, and I would rate that a 5 too. And it's not the same 5.
No.
And that's what you can do it. There's social science instruments to measure it, but they're not measuring it yet, right? Like, you're not measuring for awe yet. It's something else. So when you go on Amazon, like 50 Shades of Grey gets a lot of 5s. And so does Anna Karenina. Not the same 5, right? We were talking about different 5s. And I think right now, your colleagues just aren't, I guess Matt is starting to, right? Matt Killingsworth is starting, but a lot of people aren't yet measuring transcendence or awe or meaning. It's, so let's say I have that one moment with Rusty, and then a lot of the rest of that's my son, and then the rest of the day is kind of not so great. But how does that one moment stack up against like 7 moments of like, oh my God, please stop talking back to me? It's still like an off the charts moment, and you don't have like a mechanism yet I haven't seen a mechanism yet that corrects for that, right? That's what I would say. So, no?
No, we're not going to agree on this.
We're not going to agree.
No,
but it's not the same 5.
2 things can be 5 without being the same, but 2 things can cost $9 and not be the same thing too.
Right.
But you don't say, well, then that is just not measuring what they cost. Well, it is measuring what they cost, it's just not measuring everything about them. And there's 2 experiences that are both 5, but they're very different in other ways. And I think what you're saying, what we would agree on, is there's many things other than how happy are you feeling right now that we as human beings care about in life. And those things, even if it were true that children did not maximize your answer to that question, maybe they maximize your answer to other questions that are important and useful. Who would disagree?
Then you're just saying it better than me, because I actually was trying to say, more or less the same thing. And all I was saying is that when people push back on this, they might be pushing back because one day your colleagues will design something that will actually capture that thing I just talked about, and sort of show and figure out a way to say, like, look, who has more awe in their life?
Right.
Who has more moments of transcendence in their life?
Except the only problem is that when you do ask people questions that are kind of like that, you don't really see parents going, oh, okay. On the happiness question, I wasn't all that happy. But you just asked me about how good is life, how important, how meaningful. Most studies show there's no difference between parents and non-parents. Some show a little advantage for parents.
I see meaning advantage in at least 2 big ones. I would say I think there is.
I think there's a reason for that, which is when you ask about meaning, people think, well, let's see, what makes life meaningful? Children do, and so they give the answer
I can
that's
give a
prescribed.
different answer. Parents generally rank, when they're looking at depression scales, I mean, this was the most interesting thing in Robin Simon's work. So men who don't have, if in fact parents are less happy than non-parents, then you would think that men who don't have custody of their kids would be the happiest, but they're miserable.
Right.
And my feeling is, and she was using a depression scale. And what are the questions that they use, that the CDC uses? It's like, do you feel like you have a reason to get out of bed this morning?
Right.
Do you feel like your life has purpose?
Yeah.
Do you feel like, and I can
Yeah.
understand why if you don't have custody over your kid and you feel like you don't have any agency in this way, you might be checking a lot of negatives
Yeah.
on that. And that to me explained a whole lot.
Of course, as you know, I have one child. He's 38 years old. So
Right.
when my wife and I have no reason to get out of bed in the morning, we think it's great.
Yeah, but that's different. That's different. And also you've done it already. So,
Yeah. Well, look, I think it would be. I think everybody would agree that children bring you certain things and they take away certain things.
I think that's true.
I think for me, when the reason this fact that is such an important part of your book shocks people is because when they imagine being people without children, they're actually imagining losing the ones they have.
Right.
And losing children you have is a horrible experience that's nothing like never having had them in the first place.
Correct.
And so you think, my children give me such great meaning. Yes, they do. But the people who didn't have children have something else in their life that gives them great meaning.
Yeah, I don't want to suggest
Yeah.
that parents have the lock on meaning. They
No,
don't.
you're not suggesting that. But I think that's part of why
yeah.
we who are parents find it really hard to believe that we haven't been elevated by this experience. It's
Right.
because if we hadn't had that, we would have probably been elevated by a different
By something
experience.
else. I think
Yeah.
that's true. Although I think that it's a really great way to be elevated and still be lazy. You just have to get pregnant, or it's not. It's like the least imaginative way to add meaning to your life, basically. And it takes the least amount of effort. That's what I would say. So, that's my
Really?
quick
Easy-
law
It's harder, it's easier than religion?
to get pregnant.
Joining a church? This is your next book. Cheap
I
and
mean, I
easy
really-
routes to meaning.
I mean, if you're a religious person, then yes, you're right. It's very easy. No, you're absolutely right. No. I guess
Yeah.
you're right. I'm saying this as a person without a single religious instinct.
So
You're
what's-
absolutely right. I
what's
take
the
it back.
thing that-
Being serious for a minute.
Well,
I've just tipped my hand as like a blue state, like horrible. Yeah. Anyway, yes, you're
So we're going
utterly
to bring
right.
all of these nice folks into the conversation in a
Yeah.
minute. But I just want to ask you, maybe as a last question, what's the thing that everybody's misunderstanding? Because I've watched you be interviewed on TV and stuff, and I keep getting the feeling these people don't understand what your book is about. So what for you is the thing that everybody is not
Well, on
getting?
TV, nobody understands what
They would have to read it. Yes, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, what's interesting to me, actually? Every interview unfailingly does gravitate toward the negative stuff. Almost no one does want to talk about the joy stuff. And I
Right.
devote like a lot of ink
Huge
to
amounts.
huge
Yes.
amounts. And yet, it is amazing that people just want to bang on, and maybe because they've been given, someone kicked the door open so they walk through, and they're like, yeah, tell me about it, But I am, to me, the biggest surprise in all of these contexts is that there's this pent-up need to air out all the negative stuff. It's not that people are like willfully, misunderstanding or being obtuse. Although I'll tell you, I do. So Brian Greene, the physicist who wrote, so he told me that when he'd written The Elegant Universe and he would go on the book, circuit, and invariably on TV or, in a bookstore, someone would raise their hand and say, but what about infinity? And he'd be like, I'm writing about string theory. I don't know what to say about infinity. And I sometimes get like questions that are like, what about the mommy wars? And I'll be like, they're fake? I mean, like, I don't have anything to say.
Wow.
Or they'll ask advice or, and
Well, you're
those
now
are
an expert on everything.
related to, I
Paternal
think
and
they think
maternal.
that I've written a parenting book.
Right.
They think that I always just shrug
In
it,
some
yeah.
way you have. I mean, I think this
Yeah.
is probably the smartest book about parenting I've ever read, and I would recommend to anybody who's getting into the parenting business to read it, because I think
That's
it's one of the few books I've ever seen that just unerringly tries to ask the hard questions and tell the truth about this thing that most of us do that's so rich and interesting and
You're just reminding me.
frustrating and odd.
Okay, you're just reminding me. Thank you. So there is one thing in terms of being misunderstood. I do feel misunderstood when, and it's a species of question I've gotten more of recently. Literally, I won't say who it was. Somebody from a good newspaper, called me up and said, "How will you feel if birth rates go down after this book?" was like, how would I feel if like we invaded Portugal after this book? They don't seem connected. Like, I really don't know what to say to that. Like are people? But I've gotten this, and then I got another person from a very reputable publication who I think is really smart, who said, I read their book and I was really scared. Should I be, I'm sorry, I'm talking like a millennial because she was one. And, should I be scared? And I was like, I wouldn't be so faint-hearted. Either you want kids or you don't. Like, a book really shouldn't, like, something I wrote for, shouldn't really. But the species of, like, feedback that is like, this is so depressing. This is really off-putting. And it's like, I do get slightly upset and think, really, it doesn't feel depressing to me. I mean, I'm not cowed by any of this stuff. I'm not, it doesn't seem scary. Maybe it's just because I'm slightly melancholy anyway, so I read all this stuff and go, yeah, life's hard, we have duties and obligations and it's not supposed to be fun. But I mean, I find that response the wrong one.
Right.
I find it, a weird and off-putting one,
Well, my guess is that if the birth rate goes down, it's because people would rather read this than have sex.
Oh, thank you.
That's how good it is to read. We should bring our friends into the conversation because I get to talk to Jennifer all the time. So unless you don't want to, and then I'll just keep chatting with her. But would anybody like to join in to ask Jennifer questions?
I have many questions.
Can you all hear her questions? Yeah. Okay. Sure, I'll repeat your question.
So you started off the conversation talking about the kind of new importance that has been granted to children.
Okay, this is gonna. Can I stop you? Because this is gonna be way too long for me to repeat. So
Also, because Rachel's
your voice.
no, but also, you're, yeah.
able to summarize it as well.
So you started off the conversation talking about how the importance of children has increased as they've lost their economic function.
Yep.
I'm wondering whether you also see a correlation between I don't want to say the failure of feminism, but let's say a somewhat disappointing revision of feminism that has happened over, say, the last 30, 40 years, or at least the last 20 years, that there's some correspondence between a kind of new conservatism about gender roles and this kind of new importance to child rearing.
Yes and no. And it's the data on that is super fascinating because on the one hand, people are now, more people now say that someone should be home with the kid than 20 years ago. They say that a kid should have a primary caretaker, but they are less likely to necessarily say that it has to be the mom. So, like, the number of people who say that it should be a woman has gone down, but the number of people who believe that someone should be in the house, it's been slightly rephrased to be, has gone up. So we are still clearly ambivalent about women working. Is that?
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, but I also have another. But I also have another piece to add to that, which is that there's a nomenclature switcheroo that like occurred to me finally when I was so. The last time I read Betty Friedan was probably when you and I were 18 and like roommates, right? So I reread The Feminine Mystique, and there is this moment in The Feminine Mystique that's kind of amazing because Betty Friedan had gotten her hands on a stack of documents from Madison Avenue, internal marketing documents, that had sort of tried to explain to women why they should not feel like staying home with their children was beneath their educational attainments. And the reason was they were going to be domestic engineers. They were going to master the difference between cleaners that did your glass and ones that did your ovens and ones that did ring around the collar and ones that did, like, they were going to be told that they were domestic scientists. And this was the plan. And what were women called back then? They were called housewives. Now, if you stay at home with your kid, what are you called? You're not a housewife anymore. It's not about the house. You are a stay-at-home mom. You are a professional mom, and you are professionally mommying all the time. And it's not your job anymore to walk into the product aisle of the supermarket and know the difference between kinds of cleaners, because all of our houses are much dirtier now than they were in the 1970s, and we spend exactly half as much time on housework, but we spend much more time on childcare. And now our job is to walk into Bye Bye Baby and know the difference between toys that encourage gross motor skills and fine motor skills and encourage imaginative play, and which toys are manipulatives, which when I was a child were called Legos, like it's different. So, I also think that that's like some other, and to me that suggests like a pendulum swing. Anytime that women sort of make any headway into the workforce, like this comes blowing back at them. And there's another thing that can be said about this that I read that I thought you might find interesting. I loved it. So in the 80s, when women were like working, when they were wearing their Reebok shoes and their power suits and going off to, that was the moment that kids' faces started showing up on milk cartons. That was the moment that Halloween candy was being poisoned and razor blades were appearing in it. People were afraid that mom wasn't home. Anytime women seem to make any inroads professionally, there does seem to be this weird blowback. So yeah, I totally noticed that as I was reading literature throughout the 20th century, just about women would advance and during the 20s, when women were, casting the vote and wearing the pants, suddenly there was this renewed, intensified focus on raising perfect kids. Like you saw it with there was the most draconian, they wanted women to keep charts about when the baby was peeing and when it was crazy stuff. So does that sort of answer?
Absolutely.
Okay, I didn't mean to make, but,
No,
oh.
That was super interesting.
Okay, yeah, no, I wish I could have written about it longer in my book, but I wrote about it somewhat in my book, yeah, in chapter 4. You can skip right to there.
You mentioned a little bit before how several centuries ago people were having significantly more children.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what your thoughts were on the fact that people tend to be having fewer children today, and just generally how the number of children in a parent's life impacts that particular family.
Yeah, no, it's a great, and I think that this is like the scarcity principle at work. I mean, the fewer that you have of something, the higher the value you assign to it, right? So and also again for the chronological reasons I mentioned, you've waited so long that I think we assign this super high value, this high emotional price tag to kids when you have only one or two. I mean, there was that devastating moment. I can't believe I'm going to mention this, but on Downton Abbey, like a couple of weekends ago, when Matthew Crawley's mother says, well, when one's only child dies, one isn't a mother anymore. One isn't anything really. And I have only one kid. I'm a stepmother too, but I have only one kid and I just felt my whole inside just, curl up. And so I think that might speak to it. Also, just as a little factoid, if you have a college education now and you're a woman, the median age of first birth for you is 30.3. That's nationally. So imagine what it is here, and imagine what it is in New York, and imagine what it is in Los Angeles and DC. I mean, we are waiting a really long time. I mean, we're really anticipating this in a huge way.
I can speak louder too. It's recording, so we want your voice on the record.
So I have not read the book. This conversation has made me very excited about reading the book.
Thank you.
But I had a question. I guess there are a couple parts to it. One is about father-mother differences
Yeah.
in the spectrum you're describing, sort of the joy, meaning, gratification spectrum. And I'm thinking partly that mothers are still doing most of the heavy lifting.
They are.
But that there are also big race, class, culture differences. Too.
Totally.
So there's this intersection of race, class, culture, and gender that's going on. And I just wondered if your book gets into this and what the findings are.
No, it's great, and I'm glad you raised it because I should have added a caveat very early on. My book is about the middle class. If you write about poor moms and dads, their problems are inseparable from the problems of poverty. I mean, how are you going to talk about the problems of raising your kids without talking about the fact that your commute to work is 2 hours each way and you get paid a minimum wage? You can't. That deserves its own book. It deserves like thousands of books. The other thing I lopped off, I was very self-conscious of this because I work at New York Magazine, and all the New York media is accused only of being obsessed with moms who will have nannies and lots of help. So I didn't only lop off rich parents, I lopped off even a lot of upper middle class parents. It's mainly, in my book, parents who do all their own childcare and clean their own houses. So I really tried to keep it in this middle wedge. Also because so much of parenting is associated with economic anxiety, and so much of what parents don't like about parenting, I think, is driven by this kind of economic anguish. That there's these internalized kind of fear responses to shrinking economic pies and all that stuff. And by the way, I mean, not to capitulate to cliche here, but I'm going to invoke Scandinavia. In countries where there are more social supports and safety nets, guess what? Parents are happier than non-parents. So maybe having free healthcare and having free education and having doctor's office visits that cost nothing, remove some of the anguish and some of the stress and make you just able to enjoy your kid. It's conceivable. So there's that to discuss too. Just throwing it out there. Conceivable, pun, and bad pun. So the other thing to say, so in terms of the gender differences, I could go on about this for forever, and I sort of do in chapter 2, which is, so yes, you're right. Women are twice as apt to do, this is something else that I love, that you'll cite the American Time Use Survey, which unambiguously says that women do twice as much childcare and twice as much housework as men do, right? And that's the generous one. There's also a social science longitudinal study that Michigan has done for years. The numbers are even less, auspicious for women. And people will say, I disagree with you. It's like, please don't say that. Anyway, you're not disagreeing. Anyway, so, but I hate that too.
That's just evidence.
Right. You're entitled to your own opinions. You're not entitled to your own facts. Whoever said that, totally right.
Tip O'Neill.
Tip O'Neill. Okay, thank you. Good Bostonian. Eric, perfect. So, yeah, there you go. So women do twice as much of this. So what tends to, and it's not only that they do twice as much, they do much more deadline-centered work in the house. So when they are at home, they are much more likely to be multitasking. And when men are at home, they are much more likely to be monotasking. They actually are statistically more likely to be doing one thing. And when they get to work, they are much more likely to be multitasking. So if you look at the ledgers just in terms of the pure math, women and men work the same number of hours. Women do less paid work, men do more paid work. The problem is women are doing some paid work, and then they come home, and it's not a haven. It's the shot clock is running because it's like dinner by 6 and homework at 7:30, and the bath has to run, and I have to check the homework. And these are all things that women, sort of shoulder disproportionately. They also, if their brains are looked at as pie charts, which psychologists have done, and it's really neat, they assign a much bigger portion of mental real estate to being a parent than fathers do. They're the ones with the running ticker tape of concerns about, like, I got to call the doctor, I got to make sure that the camp forms are filled out, I got to do this, I got to do that. Also, when they come home, and this is a recipe for really, intense marital tension, because their husbands have worked longer hours, they come back and they might be more apt to be relaxing. But what the women see is that their husbands have put their feet up. It doesn't look fair. It looks like their husbands are watching Sports Center, and it looks like they are working, because they are. And it doesn't mean that the distribution isn't fair in some larger sense, but it doesn't feel it. And that's a source of tension, as is all the deadline pressures and all that stuff. So there are tons of ways in which, and actually what will be really interesting to see is when like another wave of kind of research comes in that looks at gay couples and looks at how like there aren't enough now. I don't think, Liza Mundy did a good piece for The Atlantic about this, but I wish that this kind of data had been more widely available and there'd been more of it. I'd like to know how this works out, when you've got same-sex couples doing this. Oh, although I can say one thing. The woman who carried the baby in lesbian couples appears to have more of a initial, anyway, piece of their mental real estate given over to their parental identity. That was a German study had looked at this after trying to replicate a study, a big one, with straight subjects, which I found interesting, but it was just once, and it was one sample size. So you can only extrapolate so far. or a small sample, rather, sorry. Yeah, one sample size, meaning one small sample, meaning I'm tired, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Thanks. Jennifer, in this middle-class world that you're looking at, is there research that you found that looks at the differences between parenting in those households where the wife is the major breadwinner, or in those households where the wife and the husband are equal breadwinners, versus
No.
households where the husband is the major breadwinner?
It's a terrific question, and it could be that such data exists. It would be probably pretty new. I mean, it's only slowly, I mean, women are starting to overtake men in these ways recently. No, I haven't looked at it, and also because my favorite kinds of studies are longitudinal, you'd have to look at people over a longer period of time. So, but God knows I would love to, update my introduction one day with that stuff, because it's fascinating. And it's a great frontier to be standing at the edge of. I mean, I think that's right to look at.
I'll ask a question if there's a pause. Okay.
Well, I have come from India. I'm visiting. I mean, I just came in December. So, I mean, not that I've understood everything, whatever you said, because of, I mean, I don't follow American English that well.
Sounds pretty good to me.
I mean, okay. My question to Professor Gilbert is, I mean, if I am not mistaken, and if I have understood you correctly, you talked about, I mean, elevated experience, I mean, heightened intellectual activity in those, I mean, in those people who are not married, I mean, something like that.
Happiness, I think. I'm sorry.
I mean, in comparison with those who are married, I mean, unmarried people also have something, better things to think about, and it's not necessary that they don't have anything to think about, something important, something like that. I mean, was that your intention?
I think I was talking about people with and without children,
Yeah.
and that does tend to be confounded with married. But I think the point I was making was that many of us who have children feel that our children give us great meaning and purpose in life. The mistake and that's true, the mistake we make is in thinking that people who don't have children must not have meaning and purpose in life. Because meaning and purpose in life can come from many things. That was the only point I meant to make. Yeah.
So, I mean, my impression is that, I mean, would you say that those who are, I mean, impotent, those who, I mean, who are sterile, sort of, I mean, they don't have capacity to procreate, they are better off than those who have capacity to bear children, I mean, produce children, something like that. So they are, so my question is, I mean, it is very obvious that those who, I mean, the basic purpose, I mean, man and woman, when they engage into matrimony, the purpose is to produce, I mean, to procreate, That cannot be set aside. And so far as role model is concerned in India, the mother's role is unquestionably more important than father's role, because man is considered to be, I mean, a person of reason and vision, whereas woman is considered to be a person of faith. And the faith is to see the children, being, I mean, children getting, children's growth and, realize their own, dreams, I mean, vicariously, sort of, So, I mean, and basically mother is a teacher. And most of the great men from India, they attribute their success to mother's role,
I can.
Jennifer would like to respond.
No, I was just going to say that, my book is very much a product of an American culture. So, speaking to, I think that I was taking a snapshot of the United States right now. And I think that different cultures have different ideas about, gender roles and about the value of children and about where women and men sort of exist in a home and in an extended family. And so I was looking at kind of America in 2014 right now among the middle class. It did not take a broader lens and go into another hemisphere and look at different traditions. And so I think, I was focusing on something separate, I think. And so it would be hard to, even look at the two side by side in a funny way.
Maybe I get the honor of the last question. So I know you told me this the other day, and maybe I heard you say it on TV too, but it really struck me. You said that your greatest fear about this book is that when your son got old enough, he would read
told it to you.
and hate you.
I told it to
And
you.
I keep thinking, why in the world would you be afraid of this? I mean, what could you be talking about? And I've just got to ask about that.
A dear friend is sitting in the front row who knows my son, and she's like, well, because, a lot of it is just that there's so much chatter on the internet that's so ugly that some of it is just crude stuff. I'm just afraid that I will be enshrined on the internet in some way as the lady who doesn't like kids or thinks that kids make you miserable, and not that it's something about parenting right now that's problematic. Some of it is that. I'm really afraid of Rusty colliding with Google, and that some search engine optimized kind of something will throw up my name. Colbert, his final parting jab to me was insanely hurtful, and I tried answering it. He said, well, that's good. You can come, I don't know, did he say, like, you can use the royalties for the therapy that your kid is going to need in 20 years? And, it's very funny, and it drew wild applause from the audience. And I was so highly adrenalized that I didn't think to cry, but I certainly did later. I tried answering honestly, and it was like, we were at the end of the segment, so there he is with his giant face and his makeup and his hand, shaking my hand. And I'm sitting there actually saying to him, I actually do fear that, because it can be misinterpreted, and because, because how do one day, look, your son's 38, so you can have a conversation with him about this. And you wrote your book when your son was already a father. I wrote this when my kid was from 3 to 6. And so how do I explain what my book is about when he's 12? I think I'm going to explain that there's something about the way mommies and daddies are doing this that's making them all a little crazy, that there are very intense pressures on us. And I was just trying to get everybody to chillax, and that will be the way that I will try and frame it.
And he'll say, Mom, no one says chillax.
You're so uncool.
Now, before we quit, I would appreciate it if you could make one public statement. When I read this book, I said, this is going to be the #1 bestseller in America. And you said, nobody's going to want to read my book. I said, it's going to be #1. And the last time I looked on Amazon, it was the #1 best-selling book in the United States. So I just wonder if you might say,
I'm sorry, I was
Dan
wrong.
Gilbert, you were right, and I was wrong.
Dan Gilbert, you were right, and I was wrong.
Thank you.